I'm John Neely, but I'm here to introduce, I'd like to say a man who needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. A man with 3 degrees, a history degree from Loyola University, and BFA from Kansas City Art Institute, and an MFA from the University of Illinois, Jim Connell.
Thank you, John. All right, I got this off the internet. If anybody knows who did this, let me know. I'd love to give them credit, but it's also got one of my pots up there, which is the only time you're going to see one of mine today. We have a lot to do. It's an hour lecture. Might go a little bit longer, but the end is the best, so hopefully you stay for it all. This is a tea leaf. Camellia Sinensis is the Latin term. All tea comes from this same leaf, except herbal tea, which we'll talk about very briefly. Now, this is the oldest tea tree. It's in China. It's about 2,000 years old, give or take 300, 400 years. It is fiercely protected by the Chinese government. Now, before we get into the origins of tea, we have to really let you know that nobody knows. It's all legends and myths and stories. This emperor is often credited with the founding of tea. Emperor Shennong was a very, very important early emperor. He lived about 5,000 years ago. He has been given legendary status, like he invented the Chinese calendar. He invented the Chinese agriculture, the plow, the axe, the hoe, and irrigation. And he also invented Chinese medicine, that he invented acupuncture. And as you can see, he's chewing on a plant. He went through chewing on anything he could find to ascertain their medicinal benefits, herbs, and of course there's stories about him getting sick. And anyways, he's often depicted with a leaf in his hand and horns for some reason that I've never been able to figure out. But all the images have him depicted as that. Now, one of the most important things he did, and especially for this story, is that he decreed to his people that they boil their drinking water. And we in the modern world know exactly why that's beneficial, health-wise. And just to give you some context, the Europeans didn't know about this until about 200 years ago. Boiling water with all the little germies running around really improves the quality of life. So 5,000 years ago. Now, the story associated with him with tea is that one day while walking through his kingdom, he stopped, the entourage stopped, his servants went about boiling his drinking water, and it just so happens that they were strategically placed underneath a tea tree. And some dried tea leaves fell into the boiling water. And because he often tasted and tried different plant life, he decided that he was going to drink that. And he enjoyed the exotic and invigorating qualities of the infusion, and the rest is history. We don't know if this is true, but it's a good story. It's a damn good story. Now, there's also a story that the Chinese love to tell about the monkey myth associated with tea, and there's various different stories. The most popular is that villagers were taunting the monkeys in a tea tree, and they became very mad at the villagers, and they gathered up branches and leaves and threw them down at the villagers below. How it got into water, they never explain of all the readings, but there's also stories where they were duping Western traders into believing that there was a tea that was so difficult to get that they had to train monkeys to pick it. Now, none of this is true. The Chinese always talk about it and tell the tale with tongue in cheek. And however, there are few people or a few out there that still believe and cling to that. Now, the Buddhists came to China about 1,500 years ago. This is Bodhi Dharma. Bodhi Dharma was the founder of Zen Buddhism, and he came to China from India as a missionary. And the story is that he decided that he was never going to sleep and that he was going to use that time for his meditations. Well, alas, one night he did fall asleep, and upon awakening, he was so upset with himself, he ripped off his eyelids and threw them on the ground. A couple of years later, while passing that very same spot, there grew tea bushes. Now, once again, this is not true, it's a myth, but every important person in China loves to attach themselves to the tea myth. We'll get back to the Buddhist in a little bit. In reality, we have some archaeological digs and some written records going back about 2,000 years, but it really took off with Lu Yu's book, The Classic Book of Tea. This is a rather short book that talked about the growing, the processing, the implements, and the etiquette of tea. And to this day, it's still a very influential and important book in China. We do know that tea originated from the southern portion of China in the Yunnan Province. Also, when I was in China, my guide translator pointed out that the modern day map of China looks like a chicken. Did anybody see that before? Now I can't help but look at this map without seeing a chicken. Now, Chinese tea has three main stages. The very first is a tea we rarely see in the Western world, although it's making inroads. That's called cake tea or brick tea. It's an ancient method of putting it together. And when I say putting it together, it is a conglomeration of tea, spices, salt, orange peels, flour, vegetables, rice, and it's all mashed together and fermented and then pressed into these various shapes that you see. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the packaging for that, and that will occur later on in the lecture as well. This is still very popular in China, very popular in the northern and western frontiers of China. And you can get it in America, but we just don't see it very much. Now, the second stage happened during the Tang Dynasty, and the green tea, and most all of us know what green tea is. Starbucks is selling it, it's bottled, and of course, the implement to make the green tea, the grinding of it is in the lower right. That's from the Song Dynasty. And I don't know if you can see it, and I don't know if this is going to work, but right in the middle, right there, that's the apparatus in use. You got that? And then, of course, this on the far left, you see the mill down there in the corner there, and the more modern colored picture of the same type of mill that's in use today. Green tea is often talked about as being the pure form. It's oxidized. Still very popular in many parts of the world, and you can even get it in America. Then the last stage, which happened about 500 or 600 years ago, was the tea that we all know, the steep tea, the leaf tea, the tea that's in your tea bags. And we don't have to talk too much because everyone in here knows what this is. Now, in China, there's 8 classes of Chinese tea. We're not going to go through this. It's too long and too difficult to break these down. We'll let you look at them for a minute. But just realize all of these tea comes from that same tea leaf I showed you in the beginning, the Camellia Sinensis. And then, of course, there's subcategories. And there's even more. And as you go around the world, there are a gazillion types of tea. When you consider blended teas and spiced teas and flowered teas, they say that there's upwards to 300,000 to 400,000 different types of teas that have been put together, all coming from that Camellia Sinensis tea leaf we showed you. And we'll get around to how that happened. Now, what I want you to make sure that you understand is that we're not talking about the herbal teas in this lecture. In China, anything that's boiled in water and infused is called a tea, but for this lecture, we're going to stick with the caffeine-laced hardcore stuff. Celestial Seasoning, if you didn't know, started in Colorado in the late 60s. And they do have caffeine tea as well, but these are classic herbal teas. Now, we all know that tea is a healthy drink. The very fact that you boil the water is going to promote that right away, but it does have all the vitamins and minerals and proteins associated with a very, very healthy drink. You cannot deny this. However, across the world, particularly in Asia, there are so many claims that it can cure almost everything under the sun. If you get into China and you don't feel good, you go down to the street vendor and they'll put together a concoction that'll cure. However, clinical scientific studies have been disproving that. But of course, if it was curing cancer and keeping, the aging down, we'd all be drinking it by the gallon. However, it is a very, very, very healthy drink. It did start as a medicine in China, and during about the Tang Dynasty, it started to become a beverage. We go back to the Buddhist, and the myth, forget that for right now. The big contributions that the Buddhists had to tea is that they started growing and cultivating the tea around their monasteries. Very, very important, and spreading the use of them. Very healthy drink. And of course, there's always the story of the Buddhist monks that were falling asleep during their meditation and having a little drink of tea to wake them up. And of course, we're going to have a lot of nice images of people out in the fields. Now, interestingly enough, at about the same time, and this is about 1,500 years ago when the Buddhists came to China, in the West, in Europe, we had something similar going on with the Benedictine monks. They were growing wine or grapes and barley and the grains, hops, for their very safe, healthy drink. Remember, the Europeans weren't boiling their water, so drinking water was always questionable. But alcohol was a much, much safer drink because of the fermentation process. But the problem was, in China, you had a drink that was healthy, that was keeping you awake and alert, whereas in the Europeans, you had pretty much the opposite effect going on. Damn Benedictines. All right, going back to the tea tree. In the wild, the tea tree grows about 30 or 40 feet high. It is an evergreen. It grows in a tropical or subtropical climate. And the Chinese will tell you that it has to be grown in the mountains or the valleys surrounding the mountains, and the importance of that. And then we're going to go through a bunch of really beautiful images of plantations or farms in China and around the world. I love this next one. Springtime. Now, tea grows in 52 different countries around the world now, but it, of course, originated in China. And for the most part around the world, the picking of the tea leaf has been an occupation primarily for women. We'll get back to Darjeeling a little bit later in the slide lecture. Isn't she feisty? And I love this photo, but this one's my favorite. So we're all through Asia right now, but other countries, it's traveled far from Asia and grown in places like Iran, Russia, and in Africa. And in America, we have two places that tea is grown. One in Hawaii. They've got that climate and the mountains. But then the weird one is South Carolina, and it's near Charleston. And if you've ever been to Charleston, it's flat as a pancake. There's not a mountain to be seen, but apparently. Now, this was started by Lipton and now independently owned. Now, probably, and I'm not going out on a limb here, probably maybe because of the association with women doing the field work and picking, many of the early tea advertisements had women associated and helping to sell the product. So now, once you have the tea grown and the tea picked, you have to take it to the processing. And this is where the tea really changes and where we get so many different varieties and flavors. And it's very difficult to pin down the processing because each culture, each region does it a little bit different. So I can't go through step 1 through 10 because of the variations, but we'll show you a few of them. Withering or drying, natural drying, of course you can do artificial, and this old-timey machinery is used to roll or massage or break apart and bring the oils to the surface. Pressing, steaming, and roasting. But although this is still going on in certain parts of the world, most of the world is using heavy-duty machinery for this processing. And of course, we have to talk about the United States. 3 different things that were added to the tea culture. I don't have time to go through these. Look it up if you want to. Iced tea came with the advent of refrigeration, St. Louis World's Fair, and a tea bag in New York. I wish I could tell you. Okay, I will. A tea seller sent out samples of tea in little silk pouches. And he got orders, and when he filled the orders in crates and tins, he got complaints because, as he figured out, these people were throwing those little silk pouches right into the boiling water. Now, later on, Lipton perfected it in the 1920s. And most of the world uses tea bags, but they're not essentially that popular in China and Japan. And we're not going to talk about instant iced tea. It's not worth it. Okay, now the brewing, of course, you have to have implements to get the tea from the field into your mouth. That's a Ming Dynasty vase, and on that far left, I have the blow-up of the gentlemen, the servants, preparing the tea for their master. On the bottom is your heat source, your brazier, and the middle top, that's a cauldron. And of course, the gentlemen are putting the tea leaf in it. And a couple of other illustrations doing the same thing. Now, over on the right side, the white little cups they're using are called Gaiwans. And here is a modern Gaiwan. And these are the precursors to the teapot. I'm going to show you the very first teapot in a minute. And it's kind of shocking to me, at least, that the teapot is only 500 years old. Now, the Gaiwan, the precursor, has a lid to keep it hot. And of course, as you can see, it's a good strainer. And some people drink it right from the Gaiwan. Now, in Asia, we've had a spouted vessel for thousands of years. So the design of the first teapot didn't come as a lightning bolt genius moment. But all of these early ewers that I looked at for the first 25, 30 years of my potting existence, I just always assumed that these were teapots. But ewers are primarily for drinking wine and other alcoholic spirits, but not for tea. So we go through the sung, and I could have sworn that these were teapots too, but they're not. Now, the very first teapot was made in Yixing, China. Yixing, China is often called the teapot capital of the world. During the Ming Dynasty, the scholars went there for rest, relaxation, and retirement. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here. Most of you have heard of purple sand clay. The very first teapot, upper left, by a gentleman by the name of Gongchang, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Gongchang was either a monk or a monk's assistant. He decided one day that he was going to design a better vessel to brew his tea. And of course, this coincides with the beginning of the time when leaf tea became popular. The story says that he took some purple sand clay and sat under a ginkgo tree, looked up, and there was a burl outgrowth on the tree, and he decided to use that as the inspiration for the texture. Now, the upper left, that teapot is in the Beijing National Museum. The lid has been lost and replaced. And on the bottom right, ever since the very first one's been made, it's been kind of the rite of passage for young Chinese teapot makers to make a Gongchang-style teapot. And we're going to see a few more of those. But first of all, if you notice the small little spout, some people have speculated or shown or proved that that small spout was to be drunk directly from, kind of like a straw, but kind of like these gentlemen are doing. And my students said, how could they do that with boiling water? Obviously, they would cool it off first. And I found a number of slides with Chinese people drinking from that. All right, so Gongchang-style teapots have been made for the last 500 years, and we'll go through these pretty fast. Even the little one in the very middle. Do you see that little one? Yeah. All right, okay, we're not going to go through Yixing that intensely. That's a lecture into itself. But 8 points that you should know about that. They're, well, purple sand clay we already talked about. They're relatively small, intimate. They're unglazed, they're porous, and because of that porous nature, they're seasoned. And when I say seasoned, think of an iron skillet. And the more you use it, the better it works. And because of the seasoning, much like the iron skillet, you never wash it out with soap and water. You just simply rinse and dry. And because of that porosity, one type of tea. You don't want to mix flavors. Now, there's always the story of a well-seasoned Yixing teapot that all you have to do is put in boiling water and you'll get a good cup of tea. And I read that you're supposed to have, at least 100 infusions to get a well-seasoned teapot. And then, of course, number 8, very important, is that they're often filled with symbols and poetry. Here we go with the chicken again. Yixing is in the red. It's very, very, very close to Shanghai. Very easy access for any of the tourists that get over there. About 3 or 4 hours, depending on traffic. Pretty exciting place if you've ever gone. Some people say that this is the very first teapot. It's 20 years later from the Gongchang style that we showed you earlier. This was found in an archaeological dig in 1965 and precisely dated to 1533. And there are experts that say this was not made with Yixing clay. So, once again, scholars know a lot more than I do. Now, in the beginning, Yixing teapots were not decorated, rather simple. But over the last 500 years, the symbolisms and the poetry came to the forefront. This is one of the most important Yixing teapot makers of the Qing dynasty, Chen Mingyun. And you can see not only the poetry, but that little stamp down at the bottom center. The Yixing teapots often had the maker's mark, seal, a chop, and most porcelain and pottery made in China never had the name of the potter associated with it, but Yixing did. Not all of them, but most of them did. And a lot of them actually had the calligrapher too, their stamp as well. Now, Chen Mingyun's masterpiece, his tour de force, this is the 3 Friends of Winter, and the color and the black and white, that's the same teapot back and forth. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's 2 little mice running around. One right here and then one right up here. And because of the importance of this teapot, many, many, many of these wood bundled teapots have been made in the preceding years, including if the bottom right, you see a couple of mice running around there too. Last week when I gave this lecture, a Chinese gentleman in the audience talked about the symbolism of mice in China. Those symbols are very easily read by the Chinese culture. All right, now we're going to show 3 important emperors in China, father, son, and grandson, to the tea story. He wanted them to be more decorative, but his most important thing was that he allowed tea to be exported and teapots to be exported to the West. His son decreed that teapots could be made in other mediums besides Yixing clay. And here's some beautiful teapots in non-clay material. And then his grandson was a poet, so he decreed that his poems be placed on Yixing teapots. And ever since then, poets, the intellectuals, the politicians all vied to have their poems placed on Yixing teapots for the status and notoriety. Now, Buddha's hands chock filled with symbols. I'm not going to give you every symbol of all these teapots, but this is quite notable. The symbols speak to happiness, longevity, and good fortune. Now, I grew up as a potter thinking that, okay, when they say Buddha's hands, I just assumed that they were talking about Buddha's hands in prayer. I knew it was organic, but I never had heard of an actual plant called Buddha's hand. Last November, I went into a botanical garden in Denver, and they had this growing, and I just laughed, and it's called Buddha's hand citrus. It's a non-juicy citrus that's kind of like an orange and a lemon, but who knew? We in the West, it's indigenous to China, but other than botanical gardens, we don't see it. Although one of my students said that they saw it in Earth Fair, one of the grocery stores, but I guess the only thing you could get out of it was zest. You can find it? Oh, there you go. Well, I live in South Carolina, and we're not very adventurous down there, so maybe those in the West Coast. Anyways, there are categories of different shapes of Yixing teapots, and I'm not going to get into that. There was about 7 or 8. Just quickly, the squares usually denote the male gender, the round denotes the female, but most of them speak to the organic. Now, in the 20th century, Yixing almost fell apart. The Japanese army invaded in the 1930s, and since it's so close to Shanghai, the Yixing master potters fled. And the place went into disuse, and the kills were unintended, and it didn't revive until after the Chinese communists came into power in 1949. And then, of course, the master teapot makers returned, and in 1955, the Chinese government built the factory, the #1 Yixing teapot factory, also often called the #1 purple sand clay factory. That is the #1 teapot maker in the center, Gu Jingzhao, close enough. We'll see him later on in the lecture, so remember that slide. Now, in the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, many of these master teapots really got the production of teapots going, the slip casting for the masses. And of course, this gentleman is very important for re-energizing and training a whole generation of young teapot makers. And a couple of his famous teapots. #1 teapot maker of the 20th century. And #2 is Jing Rong, and she died just 10 years ago, and a couple more of her famous teapots. Now, when I went to China, I had to go to Yixing. Yixing is often described as a village of 1 million people, which doesn't seem to make sense, but it is a city that when I drove into that you kept driving. And everywhere I looked, to get into the center, it took many, many minutes to get in there, and everywhere I looked, I saw teapots. Teapots on the side of the road, teapots stacked up, teapots, big ones on top of the buildings, on structures like that. And while there are many, many teapots that are slip cast, there are a number of very important individuals making the one-of-a-kind too. And then some more slip cast. Now you go there are store after store after stall of teapots. I've never seen as many teapots in my life. And a couple of other 20th century famous masters. This is my favorite. I didn't even know it existed until I went over there. This is a lotus plant. And then, of course, some of the energetic, creative ways modern Yixing teapot makers have been making. Some still do the traditional shapes, but some of them are quite inventive. And of course, when I went over there, I was a VIP with NCCA, and so I got to go to a number of the big top people, and they all had beautiful cars and beautiful TVs and big houses, and they're selling quite well. Many of them have collectors just waiting to get their teapots. Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Japan. Now, a little side story. We're going to go through a number of cultures that party with tea. We've all heard of the Japanese tea ceremony, but the first was the Chinese tea ceremony. This was a formalized, very intellectual ceremony. It died out in the Sung Dynasty about 800 years ago. The etiquette continues, but you have to remember that the Japanese were not the first. They brought it over to Japan from the Chinese, so we'll get to that a little bit later on. Just remember, the Chinese were the first. Now, the emperor that said teapots could be made in other materials, we go to Jingdezhen, which is often called the porcelain capital of the world. They've been making porcelain for at least 1,000 years. And we'll go through a number of porcelain teapots, blue and white Ming. In the upper left, you see the double spout for easy grabbing across the table. We'll see a few more of those, so keep that in mind. And dragon teapots. And as you can see, they're functional but also highly decorative. I love that one on the left. Now, once you have the tea planted, tea picked, tea gone to processing, you have to take it to market. And this is the packaging I mentioned early on. Now, China is a big country, and it not only spread throughout China, but also Southeast Asia. And the tea horse trail brought it all the way to India, to the Himalayas, north to the Mongols, and we'll see another place in a few seconds. But the tea horse trail is still there, not a highway. It's a hiking trail, and whether it was human or horse or camels, it was a very long and arduous trip, going over many mountain ranges and many, many rivers. Very, very difficult, taking many months. It went as far as Russia. Now, this was supposedly 11,000 miles. The story goes that 6,000 camels would gather every year to start the caravan, and it would take them anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years to complete the journey. Very difficult. And it pretty much stopped because it was too hard to bring tea farther afield than that. So you didn't see tea in the Mideast, and you definitely didn't see it in Europe until 1610, when the Portuguese, remember the emperor that said you can export it? The Portuguese were the first to bring it to the western ports. And of course, they couldn't carry much in these small ships that were very much akin to the Christopher Columbus type ships, discovered the New World. But once Europe really had a taste for tea, that addictive quality, we started building tea clipper ships. And these were tall-masted, narrow-hulled ships that could speed up the shipping radically, super radically. As a little side note, the very first one was made in Baltimore, Maryland, but then quickly copied in European ports, particularly the British. Now, if you look at the ship on the left, that white portion above the waterline denotes that this ship is not loaded down. In order for these ships to be sailed efficiently, they had to be laden down with cargo. Now, as you all know, tea doesn't weigh that much. It's definitely not lead. So the very first thing that they put in these ships were teapots on the bottom. Other items too that China had, but most of all, these ships really, the important cargo they had were tea and teapots. And they put teapots on the bottom and then the tea on the top to keep it out of the salt water. Keep it as fresh as they possibly could for the long voyage. Of course, back then they didn't have plastic or any of those other problems or benefits we have now. Now the problem is, the very first teapots that made it to Europe were Yixing teapots. And remember what I said about them? They were porous, and since they were at the bottom, they were inundated with salt water. Now, these are from shipwrecks. But you can see how the packaging quality, and once these teapots were inundated with salt water, they were tainting the taste of the tea. Also speaks to why Europe, especially England, put sugar and cream or milk into their tea. The Chinese really think that that's an abomination. I think I read something that they pollute it with cream and sugar. Anyways, so the Europeans started saying, well, listen, we love these, and they became the standard of European teapots, but they wanted porcelain. And we'll get back to that in a minute. First of all, we're going to look at the map. This is the first international trade route. Europe wanted all this good stuff from China, but China looked at Europeans as barbarians and couldn't see any of their manufactured products valuable enough to trade. So the Chinese insisted on silver and gold. And of course, this created a very, very difficult trade imbalance. Not only tea and teapots, but the silks and these spices and the other goods from China. But the number one thing that was being shipped was tea. And two companies, the British East Indies and the Dutch East India tea companies, facilitated this. They became exceedingly rich. They were monopolies. They were so powerful that they had their own standing armies and navies. And of course, there was only one place to get the tea, and that would be China. Now, some of the, when Europe was clamoring for porcelain, the Chinese weren't going to send the very best to Europe, so they put up export ware. Still very good, something that European people couldn't make, couldn't get. So anything porcelain that was brought over from China was highly valued. And the Chinese were also making these teapots with Western motifs on it. What did they know about the West? Well, they knew about the ships, because that's pretty much, other than, sailors and the traders, they didn't know much about the West. And I can get an idea why they thought the Europeans were barbarians, if you know anything about sailors. But anyways, the Europeans didn't want this. The Europeans wanted Chinese motifs. Now, interestingly enough, coffee and tea hit Europe at about the same time. Coffee from Ethiopia, and 28 years later we had tea. Remember, before that, the healthy drink in Europe was alcohol. So all of a sudden, Europe woke up, literally. And out of that awakening, what really followed was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, was the philosophical thinking and all the advancements that have happened after that. These are the famous philosophers, Voltaire and Rousseau, and the lady is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was an early feminist writer from England. Now, Europe had a problem because their low-fired pottery would crack when boiling water would be put in there. So it took them about 60, 70 years before they improved their ware to make their own teapots. But as you can see, they used the Yixing teapots for the inspiration. That's Dutch on your left and English on your right. And these are Germans, all of which were inspired by the Chinese Yixing teapots. Now, the gentleman on the bottom, Johann, was the man that invented or discovered soft or hard paste porcelain, which is a pseudo porcelain. And his factory in Germany, the Meissen, started producing porcelain, semi-porcelain, out of their factories, complete not only with the Asian or the Chinese shapes, but also with Chinese motifs. The term chinoiserie means in the Chinese manner, and it was all the rage in Europe. As the Europeans looked upon anything that was coming from Asia as exotic and wild and great, they couldn't get enough of this stuff. So German, now we have English, and we have the Wedgwood, of course. And almost all of the European teapots, their shapes and motifs were very much Chinese. You can see the Tang Dynasty colors, and in the upper right, you have the Yixing wood. Now, we all know Britain loves their tea. Britain has a very strong tea culture. They drink more tea than any other country per capita. India drinks more tea, there's more people. But per capita, the Brits drink more tea. Now, they had a problem. They could only get tea from one place, and that would be China. And remember, China only wanted gold and silver, so the Brits had to come up with a solution. And what they did was to grow poppies in India, process it into opium, and ship it to China to raise the money to get for the tea. And of course, the results was really, really devastating to China. The Chinese government did not like this. It was ruining their agrarian economy and society, pretty much addicting anybody near the source of the opium. And so the Chinese government went about destroying all the shipments of opium that was coming in. Here we have them on the streets, but what they really did was they threw them into the ocean. I would imagine if you were addicted, you'd get down there and scoop up whatever was on the street. But the point was, the English weren't very happy with the solution, so they went to war, the white man's way. The opium wars are also called the tea wars. There's two of them. They lasted for 20 years, 1840 to 1860. And of course, the English won. The ports were open to Western trade. The Chinese society really started to fall apart. The Chinese didn't recover until about 30 years ago. And we all know the economic powerhouse that China is now. But another thing happened at about the same time. The British East Indies Company commissioned Robert Fortune, who was a Scottish botanist, to spy on the Chinese to discover how tea is grown and how tea is processed. And he spent 3 years in China disguised as a Chinese merchant, and I have no idea how he pulled that off. But the story is that he stole 20,000 plants, cuttings, seeds, as well as about 24 growers and processors, and smuggled them out of China, bringing them to the English colonies. And he had a dickens of a time to do that because, starting, not only the ocean travel was very difficult because of the salt water and the salt air, he was aided by these Wardian cases, which are nothing more than little greenhouses for that ocean-going problem. And after some years, the first plantation that really took off was in Darjeeling. And you tea lovers out there have heard of Darjeeling tea. It's in the northern part of India and the mountain areas. Now, the Brits also are known for their Brown Betty teapot. Garth Clark's Sea File just had an article about this. The Brown Betty is a red clay teapot. It's been made for about 300 years. The brown is very important because it doesn't stain the teapot. And if it chips, well, you've got red clay along the spout area, so you don't really see the chips. But for 300 years, this teapot has evolved and filled the households of almost every home in England and around the world. But they say that tens of millions of these have been made. They're still being made in the Philippines. Classic, huh? Now, we go to another country that has a little party atmosphere with tea, the British tea time. Now, in 1840, the Duchess Anna started the tradition. The Brits, the upper class, the aristocrats, eat dinner at 8 o'clock, so having a little bit of tea and a little bit of a repast at 4 was perfect to hold them over. And it's counterintuitive. The well-off had low tea because they weren't working, but the workers had that at 6 o'clock after they got off work, often associated with their dinner. And of course, here we go with the repast. That's savory to sweet. The story is that even during World War II in a battle, the British Army would stop for their tea at 4 in the afternoon. Very, very strong. Now, another party in England, Lewis Carroll's, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, Alice, and of course the Disney version. And this is not British, but I had to include it somewhere, so we all know Mrs. Potts, French. Now, another country that has a very strong tea culture, the Japanese. Buddhist monks from Japan went to China to study and brought back tea 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago. Japan got hooked on it. This is a very famous painter, Aoki Mokube. But he loved tea and teapots, and he fashioned a number. And I don't know if he started it, but that classic side handle is evident here. And many of the other important clay making areas in Japan followed suit. Don't know if these are actually functional. They're beautiful. And then, of course, we have to show Mr. Hamada. And then in contemporary Japanese teapots, we have, still going strong, wide variety. And I could go on, but, the lecture has to move on, so we're not going to devil too hard in any one place. I'm generalizing here, but at the same time, we have to move along. Now, you're going to be really mad because I'm not going to talk much about the Japanese tea ceremony, other than the fact that it started in China. It was codified and formalized, in the 16th century, 1600s. Very important in the Japanese culture. It could be an hour, 3 hours, or all day, associated with food, meditation, walk in the Zen garden. But it's a lecture unto itself by somebody far more knowledgeable than me. Just remember the Chinese started it first. And of course, that's Bodhi Dharma in the back. Remember the guy that ripped off his eyelids? Now, we all always think of the Japanese as owning the tea ceremony, but the Koreans have a tea ceremony that is equally as important to their culture and about as old as the Japanese. The Vietnamese have theirs. And on the bottom, you can see it's associated with their weddings. And even Russia has their own. Don't these guys, aren't they dour looking? Come on, smile, guys. Now, almost every other culture in Asia has a form of some celebration or gathering with tea, not just the four that I showed you. Now, we're going to go through the contemporary teapots rather quickly because most of you know all these, and we're not going to really, we're going to celebrate those great teapot makers, but we're not going to really stick with them for long. George Orr, often called the father of the modern studio movement, and you notice the double-spouted, double-handled teapot on your right. And Bernard and his son, and I gotta tell you, I love Bernard, I love him to death, but that is the ugliest spout I've ever seen. His son made a much better teapot. And then, of course, you got Pete and Ken. And the king, the goat. In sports, they have the goat. Have you heard this? G-O-A-T, greatest of all time. And I gotta say, Richard is the greatest teapot maker in the world, bar none. Arguments can be made, but he is right up there. Now, remember, the Yixing teapots are filled with symbols that they can easily read in their culture. Well, Richard's symbols are quite easy for us to read. His social and political agenda is quite evident. He's obviously against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. This is the old 3 Mile Island nuclear cooling towers. And the knobs, of course, are the mushroom cloud and the skull death looking at it. And if you can't figure it out by the imagery, his titles, pinpoint it. The title on the right is called A Military Intelligence, which, of course, is an oxymoron. And now Richard will insist that his teapots are functional, but at the price he has, I wouldn't put boiling water in these, but he insists that they are. And my students asked, is the house image on the upper right, is that a teapot? And yes, it is. You can see the chimney as a spout and the handle in the back. Yay, Richard. All right, we have other great teapot makers. John works after the Japanese tradition, and Pete is strong in the Yixing. And then we'll rapidly go through these because there's so many that I can't include everybody, and we don't have time to really go through this. So whether we're looking at functional teapots or in the modern world, we have a whole slew of sculptural teapots that have been made. And of course, these might actually work, but they're definitely more sculptural than they are functional. And of course, at the price that these people have on them, takes them out of that realm, and the size too. but some of these people might argue that they are functional. Leopold died a couple months ago. Did you not know that? Yeah, he was my favorite. One hell of a guy. And he made one hell of a nice piece of clay item. All right, so sculptural or functional, there's so many, and I really apologize if I'm not putting your favorites up there or some of the great teapot makers in this room, but I didn't have room for them. More sculptural. Now, getting back to the heart of the lecture, this is John Bartlam. This teapot without a lid and with a broken handle was found in an attic in England 10 years ago, and they sold it for 15 pounds, which is about $20. And the buyer was curious and got it authenticated, and it turns out that this was the very first porcelain teapot made in America. And it went under the auction block and generated quite a stir, and the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art bought it for, isn't that amazing? $800,000. Now, if you think that's a pretty good price, this teapot, the Egoist, commissioned by a British billionaire, designed and built by a Swiss jeweler. It includes gold, diamonds, rubies, and ivory, but not just any old ivory. It had to be Mammoth ivory. Now, I don't think that this has been used, but who knows? If you're a billionaire, you could crack it, and who cares? But this has been authenticated by the Guinness World Record as the most expensive teapot in the world. Or is it? We have another one that came in a short while ago, and our number one teapot maker from Jingzhen, I'm from Yixing, Gu, sold for over $28 million. Now, this reflects the fact that there are a lot of Chinese billionaires out there with too much money on their hands. And the most expensive or the most valuable teapots will never see the auction block. They're in the museums and cultural heritage and importance. But, you know, when we hear about some of these great paintings going for $100 million, the Gauguins, it kind of makes me feel really good that we have something going for this price. No, he died about 20 years ago. There he is again. I've gone back and forth on this piece to see if it's the same piece, and I don't know if it's the same, but it's awfully similar. Okay, the most valuable teapot collection is in Australia. Can you see his jacket? Wouldn't you love to go to prom in that? Now, America. Interestingly enough, we have our own way of partying with tea. All of you Americans out there know what I'm talking about. The Boston Tea Party. Now, the non-Americans out there, this was the start of our American Revolution, our freedom from England. And interestingly enough, well, first of all, the Bostonians were upset at the high price and taxation of tea. They dressed up as Native Americans and threw all the tea, the English tea, into the harbors as a protest. Now, up until this time, America was a tea-drinking country, following in the footsteps of Mother England. And, of course, from that time on, it became very unpatriotic to drink tea, coupled with the fact that we couldn't get in tea because the English were bringing in the tea. But we really, as a country, switched to switched to coffee. And by the way, most Americans, if they're drinking tea, it's iced tea, 80%. All right, now, we also have another tea party in America. You ready? Yeah, all right. Hiss, hiss, boo, okay. For the few Republicans out there in the audience, I apologize. Not really, but did you notice that I moved it all the way to the right? God bless her. All right, now, this is a very famous American teapot made out of silver. Anybody know who made it? Paul Revere. But God, we got a lot of good people. Here we go, Paul. Paul was a silversmith. He, for those non-Americans out there, warned the Minutemen that the British were coming, which started the first battle at Concord and Lexington. Now, the end of this lecture, we're going to be getting into the wild and silly profound. Teapots are a universal shape that almost everybody in the world knows, loves, can identify immediately. Whether it's a song, doll, costume, Broadway play, that's a koozie, the green teapot koozie. And whether it is in a formal, very fancy garden tea party or in the back alley, tea is the number 2 drink in the world. What's number 1? Water, yes. In America, that's not quite the case, but across the world, everybody loves tea. Now, there are a gazillion novelty teapots in the world. We're not going to go through very many of them. There's just way too many. These 2 books are very important if you want to buy them. I highly recommend them. You'll have a nice little laugh. And just 4 of them. And so whether they're naughty or tawdry, humorous, that is on the bottom, the yellow is a police crime tape teapot. And Oscar Wilde, famous British playwright and author, wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray and the play The Importance of Being Earnest. He was a flamboyant homosexual in Victorian England when it was not legal to be out. And this is the same teapot, back and forth, one side showing his masculine side, the other his feminine side. It obviously speaks to gender fluidity and about 5 other things, a lot of symbols in there. Social Darwinism, also based after an opera. Big teapots. This contraption's from North Africa. Puzzle teapots, for those that aren't familiar with this, there's no lid. So the puzzle is, how do you get the water in there? And it's revealed on the bottom left. It's a little funnel inside. Okay, all of you know what this is. You don't know it, but you know it. This is a Utah Teapot, very famous. It's seemingly benign, factory-made, but in 1975, it was the very first 3-dimensional mathematical model for the CGI industry, computer-generated. And since that time, computer geeks have somehow brought this into their CGI. Here we have Homer, and most of you have seen it in Pixar's Toy Story. Architecturally, this is the biggest teapot building in the world, and this is in a city right next to Yixing. Now, another view of it, biggest per square foot, but the tallest is in central China, and it is a museum, a tea museum. And love this photo, grand, but this is even better. Not a tourist destination, but I've got to make my own pilgrimage there one day. All right, many roadside attractions. This is in West Virginia. It was an old Hires root beer barrel transformed into a teapot to draw in the tourist. Advertising. This is a house in China. And a fraternity at a university in the 1950s put together the spout and handle with cardboard and got it up on the main hall's tower to turn it into a teapot as a prank. Temporary, of course. North Carolina has the Mickey Teapot in the downtown area for decades. Recently, it's been moved down the road to Old Salem. And we talked about the double-spouted teapots. Well, we can beat that. And they all seem to work. And we potters know the difficulty of making a teapot that actually functions. And of course, the first, couple dozen we make might be lucky if you can get water out of it. But this is my hero. He had a grant from the U.S. government not to stop teapots from dribbling. Now, this is from the National Enquirer magazine, and we all know how truthful they are. But in fact, what he got his grant for was from the U.S. Navy to do a mathematical study of how water flows around naval ships. But of course, National Geographic had to be sensational by putting it with the teapots. But we all know that the difficulty of making a good spout with not dribbling. And here are some practical solutions for that. And you can buy these. Go to Google. Don't know how well they'd work, but they're out there. Origami. There's lots of origami teapots, but nothing to the extent of this one. Here's the battle plan. Can you see that? Over 2,000 folds. And one of my students asked, does it work? No, of course not. Well, maybe once. Teapot tree in Madagascar, the baobab tree with a very well-placed branch, turning it into a spout. We've got compost, formal gardens, large teapots. That's Gary Erickson. He also died about 4 or 5 years ago, one of our own. That's a big pot factory in Jingdezhen. This is a Malaysia, a cult, a religious cult in Malaysia built this park, and they ran afoul of the local government, and the local government came in with a bulldozer and tore it down. But before they did, somehow it got singed, making it look like it had been on the stove. This is in Borneo. It's a traffic circle. The Sultan has benevolent sculpture for his something to do with his goodwill. Big teapots and little teapots. And this Art Deco cube teapot was designed for ocean-going travel, so it wouldn't tip over in the high seas and easily stowed away. And this particular teapot's from the Queen Mary ocean liner. I found this on a website called Geeks Are Sexy, and I don't know what they're doing or what context, but you can determine that this is a well-made spout that has a nice stream, as opposed to this one that I'm glad you're laughing. I had a good time putting this lecture together. Crazy humor. All right, now, JCPenney's put together this kettle, and they advertised it on billboards, and they immediately got complaints from motorists driving by. The motorists were seeing an infamous human face in that, and they were very upset. Does anybody see the bad man? Hitler, there we go. Yeah, just enough reference to Hitler. All right, now these are called long pots, and they were invented for tea houses that were very crowded and hard to get to pouring. And out of this, Chinese tea dance developed. And you can go to YouTube and look at it. It's a very hard, a difficult physical dance to master. There's 18 different movements and steps. And women were not allowed to perform it, but of course, yay, women, they got their rights, but very, very physical. This is, in Thailand, a street vendor, the guy on your right. There's a YouTube video of him I highly encourage you to watch. He dances, spins, and pours the tea back and forth from these containers without missing a drop, losing a drop. Japanese robotics, it brews, pours, serves tea. Geologically, we have any form that has a spout, everybody labels as a teapot. Some of you might have remembered the teapot dome scandal in U.S. history. On your upper left, is from Wyoming. And then, aren't these beautiful? And this is from the Cam Teapot Collection, which is in North Carolina. And they won a big grant to build their teapot museum until the legislation got upset that all that money, wasteful tax dollars, were going to build a teapot museum. But go to the website to look at their great collection. Now I found this is not a teapot. It looks like one, but it's not a teapot. And I found it in a Smithsonian magazine. It's quite old. And I laughed when I found out what the use and what it was designed for. Anybody? No, not an airbrush. Nope. One of my students said this is a bong. No, it's not a bong. I'll give you a clue. Back in the day when pills were big and chalky and hard to swallow, you put your lips around the end and you dropped a pill into that shaft, drank, and it would flow through across your tongue and down your throat quite easily. Nowadays we have gel caps and an easier method of taking a pill. Yeah, weird, but it worked. Kintsukuroi is a Japanese method of repairing broken pieces of pottery with gold, silver, lacquer, often increasing the value and increasing the beauty. But this teapot is kintsukuroi on steroids. Fountains all over the world, America on the top, Iran and China on the right. And in Austria, a group of designers got together with drones, equipped them with computer-guided drones and LED lighting. And here they are ready in a fleet, ready to be sent up into the sky to do what they call drone light painting. And here's one of the results of their, isn't that wonderful? Creative people with teapots. And then, of course, as we're looking up in the night sky, we see that there is a teapot constellation. On the upper right, that's the Milky Way. And a lot of people like to point out that it looks like steam coming out of the spout. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you.